Thank you very much for joining us today and part 2 of our collective learnings for building political momentum at CSW and beyond. It's the second session in a series of 2 sessions that we have held. Last session was yesterday, and that was focused on CSW for beginners, an introduction to CSW as a political space for the advancement of women's rights and understanding what takes place there and who organizes there, and what is the purpose of that session, as well as beginning to explore our engagement within that space. But today we're going to delve much deeper into the political organizing and movement building of MenEngage Alliance, within the broader feminist mobilization at CSW. So appreciate you participating today. We have a phenomenal lineup of speakers with such rich expertise on a variety of topics, themes. So really looking forward to today. Yeah, and as I mentioned, this is part 2 of a 2-part series that started yesterday. So really excited to take the time today to delve much more deeply into the politics, around our own engagement in CSW, as well as the deeper political organizing taking place from feminist, LGBTIQ, youth, and other justice movements within CSW, and a deeper understanding of what is our role within that space. What is the broader, both geopolitical context that we'll be exploring quite deeply, Backlash today, how that is influencing CSW. And so we're really looking forward to delving a bit more deeply into those topics today. And just a big thank you. This session is co-organized, alongside MenEngage Africa and NAMEN, North American MenEngage Network. So a big thank you to my colleagues in this collaboration. As we know, this is in the lead up to CSW67, and I'm sure all of you are aware, but for those who may be joining for the first time and hearing this information, this year's theme at CSW is innovation and technological change and education in the digital age. Such an important topic, when we're thinking about women's rights. So excited to explore the politics within the deeper context of this priority theme. And just that this is part of the MenEngage Learning Collaborative, which is precisely a space to come together to learn collectively from each other. And so we're excited to have these series be part, within the collab space, and so just to share that these materials will be uploaded to collab, as well as the presentations, so that you can have that as a resource bank for your own continued learning. So now we're really excited to meet you. Thank you for joining. And maybe do you mind taking a moment to, in the chat, share your name, your location, and your organization? And yeah, what do you hope to learn today? Just take a moment to introduce yourself. We'd love to understand, what are your expectations for today? Just so we know, as well for speakers, to be able to read your contributions and make sure that we're addressing everything that you're hoping to get out of today's session, as well as who you are, where you work, and where you're joining from. Thank you, and please do so as we continue on with the agenda. Well, we have an incredible lineup of speakers, as we mentioned. It's quite a dynamic and filled agenda, so hopefully you will enjoy the session today. Please do share your comments and questions in the chat as the session unfolds. And to start us off, we're really excited to introduce Bafana Khumalo and Samitha Sugathamala, who are our MenEngage Alliance co-chairs. So they will be sharing some thoughts with us as we launch off today's session. Thank you so much. Samitha, over to you.
Thank you, Jenny. And thank you, everyone, and welcome to all of you. From wherever you are joining, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm also extremely thankful for the team at MenEngage Global Secretariat, MenEngage Africa, and North American MenEngage Network for organizing this important event as CSW67 is just around the corner. And also for the very informative session that we had yesterday, I felt it was very useful, and I think it will definitely build on to what we are going to discuss today. Because we all know that CSW is an important space for political commitment for women's rights and gender justice. And we also know that the patriarchal backlash is also deepening globally in a very complex manner, and that it can take many different forms. Most of our online, offline spaces are critically becoming spaces of resistance in very subtle ways. These anti-gender politics brought out by extreme expansion of the fundamentalist groups and movements, and the growing resistance against women's rights and gender justice groups are very critical. It had also become a weapon used against feminists, and also we know that it had really disturbed the solidarity and the collective power that they bring into the conversation on systems change. And that is why today's discussion is very important, and that we really need to see how we can contribute to that. This highlight the importance of our work as MenEngage Alliance to be accountable to the feminist system change agenda and politicize our work to transform patriarchal masculinities and engage men and boys in an accountable manner. It also highlights the requirement of a very strong political commitment to stand in solidarity with the feminist, LGBTQ, youth, and other gender justice movements at this upcoming CSW67. It is only through this solidarity and strong allyship that we could fight against the insecurities, hatred, violence, the regression against SRHR, and the intentional shrinking of civil society spaces around the world, especially in the global south. We know that the anti-gender, anti-women's rights agendas are becoming very prominent in global policy spaces, including that of the United Nations. That is why it is quite critical for us to analyze the need of our accountable advocacy in spaces like CSW. We are continuously observing some of the campaigns, government legislations, and NGO engagements, even at our own country levels, to undermine the work of women's rights and gender justice groups. This could also come in the form of authoritarian nationalisms or militarized masculinities, or even in the form of male victimhood. And these are some of the current trends that we see in most of the regions. So let's try to analyze these occurrings and be mindful of the harmful agendas that they could create within spaces like CSW. So I invite all of you to be part of this conversation and contribute to the accountable advocacy at CSW67 in politicizing our work in transforming patriarchal masculinities and in standing solidarity with the feminist system change agenda. So thank you so much for joining today. Over to you, Jenny, and maybe to Bafana. Thank you so much.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, colleagues. It's indeed a pleasure to have you joining us this day as we have our second session orientation program for CSW67. As Samitha, my colleague, has outlined, this is a very important space, the space of multilateral institutions that creates an atmosphere for engagement across multi-stakeholder engagements on important agendas for development in the world. I should hazard to say that this space is not without contention. As we all know, as we come to these spaces, there are contested ideas. We come with a very clear interest in transformation that may not necessarily be supported by other of the partners that come to these spaces. It therefore behoves of us to remain vigilant in ensuring that in our engagements we strengthen networking and continue to advocate for transformative agendas within these multilateral institutions. So welcome to this space, and we look forward to the training for those of you who will be joining the sessions in the coming few days. We look forward to work with you on the ground as we seek to advance the agenda that has been amply outlined by my colleague Samitha. Thank you very much. Over to you, Jenny.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your contributions, and really sets us off on the next speakers as we're beginning to explore that our participation as MenEngage within this political space has to be conceptualized under the frame of accountable advocacy, where we're working in deep partnership and behind the leadership of feminists, LGBTIQ youth, and other social justice movements, and taking into account the deeper context, such as the backlash taking root within the UN. So having said that, we're excited for the next couple speakers who are going to lead us in a deep exploration on backlash and anti-feminist backlash and patriarchal backlash, from national to regional and the global, such as the UN space. So thank you so much for joining today. We'll pass on to Alex Hernandez Gonzalez from IPAS, a lead researcher for Latin America. And IPAS is a member of the Women's Rights Caucus and leads a lot of the opposition monitoring that takes place within that feminist collective at CSW. So really excited to have you join, Alex. Thank you so much, and over to you.
Okay, buenos días a todas y todos. Es muy emocionante estar aquí y tener la oportunidad de conversar con ustedes. Primero quiero decir que este espacio estaba reservado para mi colega Jean Jefes, que es la persona encargada y especialista de IPAS en CSW principalmente, pero ella se encuentra ahora en un retiro y no es posible estar aquí con ustedes. Entonces yo voy a tratar de compartir justo el tema que es de interés para el día de hoy. Como comentó Jennifer, yo soy la persona focal para la investigación de la oposición en América Latina y formo parte del equipo global de investigación de la oposición de IPAS. Entonces, desde ese punto de vista es que les voy a compartir justo esta presentación. Primero, me gustaría empezar diciendo que nos referimos a un movimiento antifeminista o movimiento antiderechos para referirnos a un conjunto de actores organizados que actúan de manera articulada y coordinada en distintos niveles de acción. Son actores políticos, son actores que actúan, se movilizan y se organizan y canalizan fondos y conforman una red global que actúa de manera organizada en el espacio global, pero que también tiene acciones que se despliegan en los espacios regionales y sobre todo en cascada hacia los contextos nacionales y locales, que es muchas veces en donde seguramente ustedes se han enfrentado con algunas de las acciones que emprenden estos actores en sus espacios ya más localizados. Entonces son una red conformada, son todo un movimiento y utilizamos el término movimiento antiderechos o movimientos antifeministas, que también los van a escuchar como movimientos antigénero, movimientos neoconservadores, movimientos neofundamentalistas, pero en términos operativos nos gusta referirnos a ellos y a ellas como movimiento antiderechos. Y está conformado por gobiernos, por instituciones religiosas, por medios de comunicación, por organizaciones de alcance internacional, pero también organizaciones de base, por líderes religiosos, por grupos ad hoc de gremios como profesionales de la salud, profesionales del derecho, jóvenes, grupos de padres con tendencia conservadora. En fin, es toda una red que se despliega y que actúa en esos niveles. IPAS no es la única organización que se dedica a monitorear y estudiar a estos actores a nivel global. Hay otras colegas que también hacen ese trabajo y que colaboramos conjuntamente. Aquí les estoy compartiendo justamente un recurso de una de ellas, de el proyecto de el Observatorio de la Universalidad de los Derechos, que es un proyecto en el que colabora también nuestra organización aliada AWID. Y solamente para mostrarles algunos de los principales actores internacionales que se articulan de manera coordinada para tener incidencia y espacios de acción en los organismos internacionales de derechos humanos. No me voy a detener en detalle en esta diapositiva porque les quiero mostrar más adelante ejemplos específicos de cómo estas organizaciones actúan en el contexto de las Naciones Unidas y de manera particular en CSW. Pero que sepan que están conformadas y conforman una amplia red que, como les decía al principio, trabajan de manera coordinada y articulada. Hay muchas formas en las que el movimiento antiderechos ha infiltrado a los espacios de las Naciones Unidas. Han avanzado muchísimo en su conformación como organizaciones, muchas veces con nombres neutrales o seculares, que dan la impresión de ser organismos que no están vinculados a alguna organización religiosa, y han empezado a ocupar los espacios dentro de los organismos de Naciones Unidas. Se han registrado, tienen espacio, tienen voz y tienen legitimidad en ese sentido para poder participar. Entonces, han avanzado mucho en ese trabajo de profesionalizarse. Tienen una amplia base de trabajo con jóvenes y otras comunidades que movilizan, capacitan y que son quienes muchas veces hacen gran parte del trabajo de presión, de movilización y de incidencia en estos espacios. De igual forma han conformado sus organizaciones que están presentes en los comités de ONGs y que tienen, como les decía, representación. Tienen un trabajo también muy claro de entrenamiento para influir directamente sobre las delegaciones oficiales. Entonces, los van a ver negociando o haciendo incidencia o lobby directo con los representantes de las misiones oficiales. Hacen también, en ese sentido, mucho trabajo de incidencia para que los puestos clave sean ocupados justo por sus aliados o por gente que ha salido de sus filas con la perspectiva antiderechos. Y la intención es justamente dos cosas: cuestionar o diluir documentos y lenguaje acordado relacionado con los derechos humanos y la progresividad de los derechos humanos, y en este sentido ponen una atención muy particular en temas relacionados con justicia reproductiva, cambio climático, derechos LGBTI, educación integral en sexualidad, todos los temas vinculados a la agenda progresista y la agenda feminista son objeto de sus ataques. Y lo que buscan es justo reconfigurar el concepto de derechos humanos y crear una lectura paralela desde una interpretación restrictiva. Los principales actores, aquí les estoy poniendo algunos de los logos de los principales actores que tienen trabajo directo en los espacios de Naciones Unidas y que seguramente muchos de ellos son conocidos por ustedes. Hay actores que tienen muchos años trabajando en los espacios internacionales. Tal es el caso de CFAM, Family Watch International, Human Life International, Citizen Go, ADF, pero hay otras, Culture for Life Africa, pero hay otras, bueno, y la Santa Sede también, que históricamente ha sido un aliado muy importante de todas las organizaciones antiderechos en los espacios de Naciones Unidas. Pero hay organizaciones más recientes que quiero que noten además sus nombres. The Institute for Women's Health, el Instituto por la Salud de las Mujeres, y el Centro Global de Derechos Humanos, Global Center for Human Rights. Estas dos entidades son relativamente nuevas y noten, por favor, sus nombres, que cualquier persona que no está familiarizada podría confundirlos con organizaciones dedicadas a los derechos humanos y a la defensa de los derechos humanos. Pero vamos a ver que tienen pues una agenda totalmente contraria a la justicia reproductiva y a las agendas feministas. Solamente como a manera de ejemplo, para tener idea de el alcance y las características que pueden tener estas organizaciones en lo individual, quiero mostrarles el ejemplo de un caso de estudio de la organización Hazte Oír y Citizen Go. Citizen Go, que es una de las organizaciones más presentes y más activas en los espacios internacionales y que está desplegada básicamente en todo el mundo, es la plataforma vinculada a la organización española Hazte Oír. Fueron fundadas por la misma persona, Ignacio Arzuaga, el español Ignacio Arzuaga, entre 2012 y 2013. Este es un gráfico tomado de este documento del Foro Parlamentario Europeo por los Derechos Sexuales, que tiene un estudio específico sobre los organismos internacionales opositores a los derechos humanos. El caso específico de Hazte Oír y Citizen Go, ¿no?, muestra que hay una fuerte estructura de financiamiento conformada por distintos actores internacionales, oligarcas, políticos, líderes religiosos, que se han encargado de financiar la conformación de esta estructura global antiderechos. Tiene además vínculo con otras redes y organizaciones internacionales como el Congreso Mundial de las Familias o la Red Política por los Valores, que son redes también internacionales de actores políticos que tienen influencia en distintos espacios de alto nivel. Y además están vinculados con partidos políticos ultraderechistas en varios países. Entonces, es solamente como para mostrarles un ejemplo de cómo cada una de estas organizaciones internacionales que actúan en los espacios de derechos humanos tienen una fuerte estructura financiera y política detrás que favorece justamente la posibilidad de que puedan tener la influencia que tienen. Algo de lo que no se habla mucho sobre Hazte Oír y Citizen Go es su vínculo originario con una organización sectaria mexicana conocida como el Yunque, que es una organización ultracatólica secreta y paramilitar fundada en México en la década de los 50, y que su misión es instaurar el reino de Dios por medio del poder político en este mundo. Entonces tiene un trabajo muy fuerte de infiltrar las estructuras gubernamentales y se ha documentado muchísimo sobre la influencia del Yunque con esta organización en particular, Hazte Oír y Citizen Go. De hecho, se ha encontrado evidencia de que sus dirigentes, Ignacio Arzuaga y Luis Lozada, son integrantes de esta organización secreta del Yunque, pero uno de sus mecanismos de funcionamiento es que tratan de borrar toda la evidencia posible que los vincule con esa organización. En el caso específico de CSW, quiero contarles ejemplos de cómo actúan estos grupos en CSW. Esto es, esto que les estoy compartiendo es del año pasado. Suelen tener estrategias de presión, de hostigamiento, de sabotaje de las sesiones, de presión a los gobiernos, de presión a los directivos de ONU Mujeres. El año pasado además, a varios de los organismos antiderechos se les limitó la participación para organizar eventos paralelos durante las sesiones de CSW. Esto por motivo de que en años anteriores han violado el código de conducta de CSW y han ejercido discurso de odio, presión, hostigamiento, malos comportamientos, malas prácticas. Entonces, el año pasado fueron limitados para su participación debido a eso, además de que el formato fue híbrido debido a la pandemia. A raíz de eso, el movimiento antiderechos construyeron una narrativa victimista y acusaron de ser excluidos o discriminados y generaron una serie de mecanismos para quejarse y generar justo una presión a los organismos de Naciones Unidas. Otra de las estrategias que tienen es cuestionar la legitimidad de los organismos internacionales y de la agenda internacional en materia de derechos humanos, y en este sentido los estándares, las resoluciones, las declaraciones relacionadas con derechos humanos. Cuestionan su legitimidad y cuestionan el funcionamiento de los organismos mismos. También han avanzado muchísimo en crear narrativas que acusan a los organismos internacionales de derechos humanos de pretender imponer o colonizar ideológicamente a los países del sur global o países en vías de desarrollo como en América Latina o en África. El año pasado, además, se caracterizó por una presencia muy fuerte y muy importante de movimientos transexcluyentes. Hubo una gran movilización y una concentración de organizaciones con este discurso de odio transexcluyente y generaron justamente muchas actividades de presión hacia el espacio. Este año es posible que se repita eso. Otra de las líneas estratégicas narrativas es la defensa de la familia. Hay una coalición específica de países que se identifica como el grupo Amigos de la Familia, que está conformado por esta amplia lista de países, muchos de ellos en África, Asia y pocos en América Latina. Este año, además, esperamos la participación muy fuerte de Hungría. Hungría se ha convertido en el modelo antiderechos en el espacio internacional, sobre todo con la presidencia, su nueva presidenta, Katalin Novák, que fue funcionaria justamente del gobierno anterior y que hizo mancuerna justo con el primer ministro Víctor Orbán. Entonces esperamos una fuerte actividad relacionada con la familia. También los movimientos antiderechos tienen declarada una cruzada directa contra educación integral en sexualidad, emprenden campañas específicas y de ataque focalizado a los organismos de Naciones Unidas, además de las organizaciones internacionales que trabajan por la educación integral en sexualidad, y generan presión directa y cuestionamiento sobre la evidencia existente sobre los beneficios de la educación integral en sexualidad. Este es un evento paralelo que sí van a realizar este año y dirigido a promover la Declaración del Consenso de Ginebra, que es un documento heredado de la administración de Donald Trump, que es básicamente para cuestionar el avance y el reconocimiento de los derechos reproductivos relacionados con el aborto en los organismos internacionales. Es una coalición de más de 30 países, todos opositores a la justicia reproductiva y el derecho a decidir, y que también promueve una agenda de la familia tradicional y en contra de derechos LGBTI. Este evento está auspiciado por el gobierno de Guatemala, el cual también es uno de los gobiernos muy aliado de los movimientos antiderechos, y tiene la participación de al menos 3 de los organismos internacionales de bastante influencia: CIFAM, Global Center for Human Rights, y el Instituto de la Salud de las Mujeres, que lidera Valerie Hoover. Como les decía, Global Center for Human Rights es una entidad relativamente nueva. Se constituyó en 2021 en Estados Unidos y se lanzó oficialmente en 2022. Actualmente es el actor principal que está organizando a la oposición para un caso específico que está en la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, que es el caso Beatriz contra El Salvador, y que busca este caso, pues, hacer rendir cuentas al Estado salvadoreño sobre su responsabilidad en la violación a los derechos reproductivos de las mujeres en ese país, y que puede tener unas implicaciones importantes para toda la región. Global Center for Human Rights se está organizando una campaña que vincula al caso Beatriz con una supuesta Roe versus Wade, como en los Estados Unidos, que garantizó el derecho constitucional al aborto en ese país por casi 50 años, y está emprendiendo una serie de actividades en contra de este caso. Entonces, aprovecho para hacerles una invitación de que en CSW se unan a todas las actividades de apoyo para el caso Beatriz y que estén atentos justo a estas narrativas que el movimiento antiderechos va a promover. Finalmente, el comité organizador de Naciones Unidas y de CSW se ha tomado muy en serio la problemática del acoso y de las presiones de los movimientos antiderechos, y va a realizar este webinario en línea, que es el día de mañana. Entonces, ustedes es en línea, si tienen tiempo e interés en inscribirse y tomarlo, se los recomiendo ampliamente. Y les puedo compartir la liga de registro por medio del chat. Eso en general, y aquí termino para dar espacio a la siguiente presentación.
Thank you so much for your presentation, beginning to help us dive deeper into understanding who these actors are and how they operate within the space. I have a million questions. I'm sure colleagues too. We're going to go to one more speaker and then open up a bit of dialogue so that we can ask some questions of Alexis. And up next, Jerker Edström. Thanks so much for joining from the Institute of Development Studies, and which is leading an initiative countering backlash, reclaiming gender justice, which is an incredible initiative. And also we'll be hearing much more and diving into depth about these dynamics. Jerker, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I believe you have my slides. Otherwise, I do have them too. But if you have them, you could maybe, yeah, thank you. So first of all, let me thank all of you, Samitha, Bafana, Alexis. Everything you've said so far is a very, fits right into what I'm going to talk about, and helps lay the ground. And I'd like to, first of all, just flag that, so Countering Backlash, Reclaiming Gender Justice is an initiative that IDS, Institute of Development Studies, we are leading with partners in 9 partners in 6 different countries across 4 regions. And we have put it together because the research so far has been very focused on the US, Latin America, and Europe. And a lot of what you saw in Alexis' presentation, for example, particularly around funding streams and so on, comes from that literature. Less is said about what's going on in Africa, South Asia, East Asia, and other regions. So we felt it was quite important to put the spotlight onto a broader set of regions across the world. So could I have the first slide, please, or the next slide, rather? So why countering backlash? I'd like to sort of go a little bit further or behind or deeper, perhaps. So we've heard a lot about a network of anti-gender actors, almost as if it's a conspiracy, but we believe it's far more complex and diffuse than that. It's not so coherent always, and it is riddled with contradictions. So I'll just preface my talk by let's beware of creating a unified idea of a backlash movement under some kind of monolithic category, because that is, this idea of us versus them is very crucial to how backlash works. So why counter backlash? Basically, in order to address it, this kind of interconnected challenges of backlash that we're seeing globally across these different countries and in CSW spaces, for example, there are three things to this, I believe. First of all, we need to understand backlash against gender justice and human rights far better, as being far deeper, more interconnected and complex than a simple pushback on feminist gains. It's about much more. Secondly, we need to expose this erosion of gender justice language and agendas within development itself. And that is particularly relevant to you all going to CSW, because this is where a lot of that's happening. But it's also happening within our regular development policy spaces and processes, gender mainstreaming trainings and so on. So that's a crucial issue that defies this us versus them idea as well a little bit, because some of the problematic comes from decades of how we have been doing gender badly. And then thirdly, obviously we need to do all of this to identify new opportunities for feminist action and for having a positive influence within this context of shrinking or perhaps hardening the civic space, a changing civic space for women's rights movements. And it may not be so much that it's shrinking, that it's changing and being captured by all sorts of new interest groups that, like we've heard about from Alexis. Could I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so we work across 4 regions: East Africa, South Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East, with 9 partners. I don't think it makes a lot of sense for me to name them out in particular. There's a wide range of partners, but you'll see next to each partner on this slide, there's patriarchy, voice, and policy and practice in different colors. Our work is organized in 3 strands of work, and I lead the strand called patriarchy. So I work with certain partners, other colleagues work with other partners. Next slide, please. Okay, so where did we start? We started looking at this as a temporal phenomena, looking at essentially exploring episodes of contention. And this comes from obviously looking around, realizing over the last few years what's going on in the world, and being inspired by Susan Faludi's original idea of patriarchal backlash. We're focusing on actions by oppositional actors with specific intentions and aims, and not just one-off reactions, because some literature on backlash, particularly in development, gender and development discourse, such as in gender-based violence, tends to frame it in terms of individual reactions of men reactively lashing back at women for their progress. So it's always, we need to think about aims and interests and different kinds of actors' engagement in this. We look at backlash in particular policy issues and spaces, and issues can be things like abortion rights or sexual reproductive health and rights, family law, gender-based violence, sexuality, legislation, and so on. And looking at how backlash is happening in terms of both real gains in those areas, but also perceived gains. It's not always the case that a lot of progress has been made. There can still be backlash. And this kind of backlash against perceived gains is particularly relevant in popular discourse, and the way that backlash actors are reframing, naming and framing things in new ways and shaming people in the process and so on. And of course, there is an interest in feminist and gender justice movements. Well, the fact that this kind of perceived gains result in backlash is to some extent a reaction to the perceived progress of feminist movements, which itself generates a counter movement against both their gains and their visibility. So next slide, please. The first thing to say about this not just being a simple reactive reaction is that many different writers in the literature have picked this apart. And of course, there are a lot of writers who describe backlash as a defensive type of reaction aimed at restoring a past patriarchal paradise or reversing progress. And that indeed does happen. And a lot of likely protagonists in that are aggrieved men's rights groups, for example, illiberal CSOs, like some of the faith-based ones we heard about just recently, and others, online manosphere communities, and so on. They're a very diverse, mixed bunch, and they are perhaps less organized and united than appears to be the case. Then there's a second kind, and this may be more familiar in development context or in the global south, of kind of apprehensive reactions or pre-actions, essentially, where you get preemptive moves to delay or cancel progress. And the likely protagonists are often elites with broader interests in the status quo, or with growing profits, such as in the case of certain capitalist interests. That's been noted in several southern countries, as well as in the north. And then we have a different kind of backlash where proactive or more revolutionary strategies are being deployed in order to shape a new future, essentially. So less about turning the clock back. And that will tend to be, at the moment, ethno-nationalist or fascist groups across Europe, India, Russia, in many, many places, Brazil to some extent. But also, obviously, fundamentalist or conservative religious groups. And we've heard about those in Alexis' presentation as well, very influential. And then there is this notion that a lot of these disparate moves by different and disparate types of protagonists come together in these opportunistic alliances and mobilizations with very instrumental aims, sometimes in contradiction with each other, in fact. And the likely protagonists include populist politicians like Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi, and others, or movements, populist movements, as well as authoritarian leaders. Again, Bolsonaro, Russia, we have Putin, etc. So next slide, please. So how does backlash then operate? That's obviously a crucial question. So if we have this confluence of, what we're seeing in politics and media more broadly is this kind of coincidence or confluence of various types of crises: political crisis, economic crisis, climate breakdown, security crisis, migrant crisis, and pandemic crisis. And all of these are seen to operate and interact, essentially. And that creates volatility in social orders and threaten the reproduction of elite rule and capitalist unfettered growth, if you like. So perceived crises and ontological anxiety, in other words, people's worries about their world falling apart and their future being compromised, that's exploited through this divisive populist politics, which gets linked to identity by these different types of actors, and they mobilize support for authoritarian solutions. And a major role in this is the use of affect, the idea of using people's anxiety to sort of mobilize them, both online and offline. So that online aspect is obviously relevant for the theme of this year's CSW, by the way. So backlash, therefore, kind of emerges organically as attempts by different powerful interest groups to manage crises through what we call spatial fixes in three key sites: the body, the family, and the nation. So in the individual space of the sexed body, gets framed as heteronormative, binary and reductive. This is very much about denying any kind of fuzzy area of trans rights or non-heterosexual sexualities, men as inherently stronger than women, and women as inherently mothers of children, and so on. And then the second one being the privatized space of the traditional family, framed as patriarchal, hierarchical, traditional, hallowed, as sanctified. Again, echoing Alexis' presentation there, and the role of the Vatican, the Russian Orthodox Church, but also Muslim organizations, and Hindutva nationalism in India, for example. The third then is the site of the nation or the nation state, and that being framed as kind of this homogeneous, ethnically organized nation, which is homogenizing, excluding and othering of outsiders, migrants, refugees, and so on. So these sites then form key battlegrounds for these contested oppositional narratives and various symbolic tropes. So this is a message I think would be relevant for CSW in thinking about how and where these opposition groups, for whatever you want to call them, what they are arguing about needs being reframed. So the family, we've heard already, is a central topic. But another one is the body, women's rights to choice of their own bodies, trans issues, and so on. They'll come in. The harder one to spot sometimes is the nation state and the ethno-nationalist politics around it. That links to the hard right that was also mentioned earlier. So this slide, thank you, is sort of trying to bring together some resonant elements for analysis. In order to understand the fuller picture, we need to think about these bigger backlash projects or movements, protagonists, in some kind of categories, not as one big lump, but they do include fundamentalist, conservative religious groups, ethno-nationalist or authoritarian groups or organizations, hyper-capitalist and neoconservative interests, often, take people like Elon Musk, for example. It would be somebody who's kind of that hyper-capitalist who's not interested in regulation or equal opportunities. And then we have alliances between all of those types of groups. The body, the sites of contestation being the body, the family, and the nation. But importantly, within all of this, there are contradictions that emerge. So there's a confluence of these different actors with their different interests in opposition to gender, but their aims may not actually align. Often their real interests are in contradiction. That needs to be exposed. They tend to appeal to past orders, the good old family values, for example, but they're often very nihilistic about the future, such as the climate and other issues. They tend to be anti-global. It's always us versus that. The global West or liberal world order is polluting our culture. But as we've heard, they are all transnationally linked. So that in itself isn't a contradiction. But they tend to paint gender as political, as being used politically. But it is actually backlash actors themselves who politically exploit gendered ideas. Next slide, please. So yeah, just to echo some of the ideas from Alexis' presentation, I don't need to go through this in detail. It happens at all these levels, from the local to the transnational. But the ways that it's playing out is both very obvious, full-on frontal assault, to more kind of overt myth-making, to undercover myth-making, this very subtle reshaping of meanings. And that's what I mean by focusing on this three sides: family, nation, and state, and body, because that gets attached to this kind of binary ideas and hierarchical ideas and exclusionary ideas, which themselves become forms of knowledge power, the way that you read reality. So next slide, please. And of course, there are different spaces of backlash. I don't need to dwell on this. There is obviously policy spaces that you'll be looking at in CSW. There are civic spaces, which is, MenEngage is a civic space for civil society organizations. The language and discourse that happens in these spaces is crucial too, and that's being under threat in some places. And there is also popular spaces, importantly, in media and culture and art and so on, where our worldviews are really being shaped. So next slide, please. And then, of course, there are different kinds of strategies to counter backlash by focusing on, for example, the discursive aspects of it. Even UN Women prepared the World Women's Report in a kind of non-gender restrictive frame to challenge this kind of view of the family from the right. So that's one type of strategy. The more practical strategies around coalition building, and I guess in this case, intersectional alliances seem to come up quite often as a recommended path to look for. How do gender justice movements ally with race struggles, or migrant rights, or and other movements, maybe even environmental movements and so on. Then, of course, there are the legal strategies, very familiar, of course, in gender work. And to some extent, it's been argued that often gender activists, we tend to focus on political problems to find legal solutions, and often legal solutions are not enough. But this is from Tessa Lewin, my colleague, her article about it never, well, I can get you that reference if you want. Sorry, next slide, please. Okay, so conclusions. Why does this matter? So the current backlash politics is about far more than pushing back on women's rights or gender equality. That's really important to remember, because it is more complex. It's about much more in reality, but it is always also about gender. That's why it's so resonant. These patriarchal reactions or instincts tend to come together. So as it's more about gender, even though it's more about gender, it is still gendered. How is that gendered? So global backlash is deeply patriarchal, both in its modus operandi and the way it's being transacted, if you like, and in its underpinning ideologies, which are always already racialized and classed as well. So understanding it means seeing how it's driven by these diverse patriarchal interests, responding to and exploiting crises, and our ontological anxieties, our worries about futures and prospects and our place in the world. So we also need to look beyond the nation. It is fought out locally, as I've mentioned, but it's always transnationally connected. The connections lie in the different types of protagonists' interests and their strategies, which need to be researched and excavated, mapped out. I saw a comment in the question in the comment line about, is there a list of all the funders of anti-rights movements, for example? Well, there may be lists, but the list is always growing, and there is so much more work to be done to map it out. And I think we're only beginning. I think the European Parliamentary Forum that was mentioned have done an excellent job in the tip of the iceberg, beginning to map this out. The Global Philanthropy Project has also done a study, Meet the Movement, where they map out some of this funding, but it's incomplete. It keeps growing. So that is an urgent need to continue to track and monitor and actually try to map. Then finally, tracking the struggles over particular policies will be important, and they need to be complementing with research and action in both economic and popular and cultural spaces and processes. And I guess I would argue that it's useful to focus on the way that these sites, spatial sites of body, family, and nation are being exploited in these areas. So next slide, please. I think that is pretty much it. Thank you very much. There's a picture of a briefing note we have that I shared with our colleagues at MenEngage, and that can be made available. Great, Grasping Patriarchal Backlash, a brief for smarter counter moves. It kind of sums up this argument more or less. Thank you very much. There is another slide, I believe, on resources and references in this, where you can find some of these other resources. It's very incomplete, of course, but actually, if you go to that policy brief, you'll find a more complete or a longer list of resources, including the Global Philanthropy Project and the tip of the iceberg from the European Parliamentary Forum. So thank you very much. I've been over time.
Birger, thank you so much. What an incredible wealth of analysis. I'm a bit conflicted because we were going to have a bit of time here to open up to Q&A, but we're running a bit short on time. So I wonder if maybe you can add your questions to the chat box. I'm sure a lot of you would like to raise some questions, and we'll see if we can get to those at the end of the session. And maybe just to reiterate, our commitment as MenEngage Alliance to continuing to explore our role within countering anti-rights backlash. And so that this is just in some ways an introduction to a much deeper journey we're embarking on to understand how we can contribute to being a meaningful part of both the analysis. I think part of it is not thinking we can jump in with a solution or do something under that same patriarchal logic, but to really begin to build movements, just as the IDS initiative is, and also following on the work of IPAS, to unpack what are meaningful strategies for us as MenEngage Alliance. Please do add your questions for Jerker and Alexis in the chat. That would be really helpful, and then we'll loop back around, but also keep them for future spaces that we organize addressing backlash. Also your comments, I've seen a lot of you sharing reflections also on how you are witnessing this within your own national context. Some really rich analysis already happening in the chat. Thank you so much. Having said that, I think we should probably move forward in order to keep the agenda flowing. And maybe just one note, we're exploring backlash at the UN, but also how this backlash is utilizing digital technologies as a space to organize, such as we were hearing with the manosphere. To organize and coordinate and mobilize in order to continue to perpetuate, gender and sexual-based violence against women, girls, LGBTIQ people. So the links as well to this year's priority theme and how the digital sphere is a breeding ground, for a lot of this backlash to find itself and to coordinate and mobilize. So I think that's a really important thread that we should continue to pull through, and obviously part of our collective agenda this year is MenEngage Alliance. Having said that, Tom, maybe if you can share the slide, we'll move forward. Yeah, as we're continuing to unpack our political organizing around this year's session, I think a really important component too is understanding feminist youth and LGBTIQ demands at CSW and our ability to stand in solidarity with these agendas, and these movements. And so we are really lucky to be joined by a series of speakers who will be able to support us, in unpacking what are the key demands this year. And really excited to welcome Saphira, United Nations Youth Representative from Baha'i International Community, who's going to share with us a bit about youth organizing demands, engagement, and political agendas at CSW this year. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a joy to be on this call and to hear some of these incredible speakers kind of share their experience and kind of help with the preparation. So I'm very honored to be here joining you. I wanted to speak a little bit about two areas of youth advocacy. So the first that I'll share is with the NGO Committee on the Status of Women. We have a youth leaders and young professionals chapter that has been organizing throughout the past year, but more intensively since January. So we've had a youth preparation series that every week we've been kind of coming together. And part of that process has been to build community, to hear from young people around the world, to get a sense of how they relate to the priority theme, to the review theme, to other emerging themes that are coming up for young people in relation to gender equality on the ground. And through that process of working with NGO CSW and the youth leaders and young professionals, the NGO committee has put together a list of 5 recommendations, which some of you may already be familiar with. But the last of those 5 recommendations is on youth and adolescence, and particularly thinking about the ways that girls and young women and youth are interacting with the digital technology. So prioritizing digital literacy skills, online safety, STEM education, particularly for girls and marginalized groups, addressing unequal gender norms. So there's been quite a bit of research done into relevant UN precedent language. So kind of going back and understanding what has been said already. Looking at how digital technology intersects with human rights language. So the human right to education, for example, and how critical access to technology is. There's also been pieces around technology and innovation in terms of action coalitions and being able to bridge the gender gap in digital access and competencies. We've been looking at kind of this connection between technology, but then also the changing world of work. And what it means to kind of develop training, education, and skills development in a way that equips the emerging generation to be able to access, economic and, earning opportunities that present themselves online. We've been also looking at data and statistics and trying to understand kind of the lay of the land in terms of looking at the state of women and girls and youth in terms of the real material world and their material reality, in addition to what is happening in the digital space. So looking at the whole person and the coherence of individuals that are trying to access digital tech, but also their lived reality. So I can put that brief in the chat. And so you can kind of turn to that and take a look at some of the language and the recommendations that NGO CSW and the youth leaders and young professionals are trying to advance during this commission. The other piece that I wanted to share was that there's a group of young people working with UN Women, and they've been doing some work on kind of global youth and adolescent recommendations as it relates to the priority theme. And they are very closely reading the negotiated outcome document. So we've already had kind of the zero draft come out. The youth have put together a very detailed analysis of precedent language, around technology, also what young people were trying to advance in the commission last year. So there's quite a detailed document, which I can also put in the chat so you can have a look. It's really looking a lot at gender transformative approaches, intergenerational spaces, moving away from youth washing and being very particular about intersectional identities, the diversity of young people around the world, building language around a whole range of themes that emerge in that outcome document. So some of those themes move beyond digital tech, but it's looking at, funding and resourcing. It's looking at climate action, women, peace and security, the future of work, food and agriculture, and then also pieces that intersect with technology. So issues around digital privacy, around law enforcement and justice. Again, the future of work, about decolonizing technology, data research and knowledge, disinformation online. So this theme was felt that technology, the digital age, as it relates to education and innovation, was so relevant to young people. And therefore, that's the reason that there has been quite a detailed analysis of the outcome document. There will be the first revision of that outcome document coming out today. So potentially tonight, there will be a new revision as member states are kind of working through that language. So the youth will kind of go through it again and continue to tweak language and continue to make those recommendations. So those are the two main documents that I wanted to share with you and talk you through, and happy to answer any questions, or if anyone wants to be involved a little bit more closely, either with the youth and adolescent kind of advocacy negotiated outcome document work, or if you wanted to be part of the youth leaders and young professionals opportunities to engage. Beyond the formal language negotiations, there'll be a range of opportunities for young people to engage with the commission. There is the Youth CSW that will be happening on the 11th of March on the Saturday. There's a youth networking event that's happening today at noon, which is an opportunity to just kind of connect with other young people and hear about their advocacy points. So I can also link that in the chat for anyone who's interested. But thank you so much for having me, and I'll hand to the next speaker.
Saphira, thank you so much. Incredible to learn on all of the youth advocacy taking place and mobilization. Yeah, please let's share those resources. And thank you very much for leading us through that. And actually, we were going to lead into another colleague now, but they're having some connectivity issues. So we'll continue leading us through LGBTIQ organizing and demands at CSW67. So we'll loop back to that, but we'll go ahead with feminist demands. And as MenEngage Alliance, we participate as part of the Women's Rights Caucus. And as most of you may know, this is the primary collective feminist advocacy body at CSW. And also important to note, the Women's Rights Caucus loops in those global youth demands, advocacy inputs too, and also LGBTIQ caucus. So it's quite a collective space. So just for us to quickly recap some of the feminist analysis, no? Yeah, and I thought this was really important to share, no? The priority theme is obviously innovation and technological change and education in the digital age. But for the possibility of reframing, no, through the feminist vision, a different way of framing and understanding of what's really at stake, no, under this year's priority theme, which is inclusion and meaningful participation of all women, girls, and gender diverse people in all their diversity in digital space and in decision-making at all levels of use, design, management, and governance of digital technologies to strengthen human rights and advance gender equality. It's moving that feminist vision to feminist systems change, which we're already hearing from the negotiations. Governments are pushing back from this priority theme, delving into those deeper topics of AI and governance infrastructure of the internet, no? Yeah, and in brief summary, the main demands are addressing the gap in digital access, inclusive innovation ecosystems, fostering gender transformative innovation and technology, addressing online and tech facilitated gender-based violence and discrimination. All of these were already priorities included within the Zero Draft. And the next three were additional feminist demands that were collectively come up with that needed to be included in this year's Zero Draft document of the agreed conclusions, as key feminist priority themes, including advancing SRHR in the digital sphere, incredibly critical decolonizing technology in the internet. We know the majority of the tech giants are based in the global north, making decisions for billions. With black box technologies, and no transparency in terms of how they operate, as well as in terms of digital access. And then women and LGBTIQ human rights defenders, and the violence that is exacerbated via online digital spaces and the digital sphere, Yeah, and just a few considerations for the feminist agenda this year is exclusion and access, So what is access? How can we apply an intersectional analysis of access and exclusion? And meaningful access includes autonomy, privacy, unsurveilled access to the internet, unrestricted access, but also pleasure, fun, and security in engaging with the internet, Thank you so much. Next slide. And online GBV, obviously an incredibly important component of this year's political feminist agenda. And the consideration that online gender-based violence is part of a continuum, So we do need to apply as well an intersectional analysis of the of online GBV. And accountability, and the consideration of accountability when we're speaking about state accountability, It's often individualized, punitive, content-centric, and that ends up disproportionately impact those who are already structurally silenced, peoples and communities, Next slide. And also really important, this corporate accountability. We know that this black box tech lacks transparency totally, and now the digital sphere has become in some ways the public square, the political square, where we express our political views, we mobilize, organize, So in some ways, it's incredibly important in the feminist vision for the internet, no, for us to reconsider, no, the governance structure within the infrastructure of the internet itself, and of course, placing profit over people, and upholds a distinct ideological system, no? Thank you so much. Next slide. And who owns the internet? Yeah, this monopoly governance where a few tech companies are, as we were mentioning, no, making decisions that impact billions of people. It's incredibly worrisome, no, and something to be challenged. And again, as we mentioned, the government seeking to avoid the responsibility of addressing this head on within this year's negotiations is something that we should take note of in our own mobilizing and our own contributions at CSW and our civil society spaces, and to continue to raise concerns about the governance of the internet, no? And in many ways, it's a replication of the patriarchal logics, no? Of control and lack of transparency. Thanks so much. Next slide. Yeah, and also incredibly worrisome is this collusion, no, between state and corporations, the use of many states of some of this big tech to surveil populations, no, for further control and monitoring. And yeah, censorship and surveillance are an incredibly important issue, no, and this sort of pairing between the state and the big tech. Is potentially, of course, a reason, no, not to maybe address it in this year's agreed conclusions, but something that we need to center, name, and also call out, no, in all of our spaces. Thank you so much. Just a quick, let's see. Yeah, and of course, this big tech being transnational, no, is operating in an ambiguous legal territory, and that their profit is really driven by polarization or division and extremism, whatever is going to cause us to click, no? So it's not human-centered, and it's really profiting, no, from an attention economy. And corporate state and anti-gender, anti-democracy actors operating in collusion. Yeah, we'll leave it at that. I just saw our next colleague join, so maybe next slide, if you don't mind moving on. Just to share as well, the political feminist mobilization at CSW is obviously towards this year's theme, but is also much broader, no? A lot of advocacy takes place around the organizing of CSW as well. We're continuing to see, for example, this year, incredible restriction, in particular for activists in the global south who are requiring a visa, where some have been experiencing almost a year lag time for an appointment, no? So a lot of the feminist organizing takes place around calling attention on these deeper exclusionary issues for participation of activists at CSW. So just to raise that as well, no, this is happening on the margins in addition to the political organizing towards this year's priority theme. Thanks so much. I'm seeing Steve has joined us. Wonderful. Thanks so much for joining, Steve. We're excited to hear from you on LGBTIQ organizing, demands, and mobilization around CSW. Over to you.
Afternoon, colleagues. Thank you so much for this space. And I must apologize for joining in the conversation this late. In fact, we are dealing with a crisis where I am. I just want to check with the moderator, how much time do I have? 10 minutes.
That's right, Steve. Thank you so much.
Excellent. No, thank you so much for this opportunity, and really to reflect and to help us look at how we organize, how do we advance, you know, some of the language that is used you know, in CSW, particularly that speaks to the LGBTI rights and issues. I think one thing that we need to acknowledge and reflect on is that the Commission on the Status of Women reaffirms, you know, the actions and the outcomes that are agreed by member states in this case. And I think part of it is also a reflection of where we come from and where we're going with the work. And I think, you know, as I just entered and we're reflecting on some of the most important elements around the priorities now, but I think it's also important to look at, you know, how we tackle some of the social issues, given the fact that, you know, we are talking about the role of innovation, technology, cultural change, and education on the digital age for achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. And here we are, you know, often even the reference of all becomes a reference of all on paper, but when it comes to practicalizing it in many communities where you draw on intersectional lens, when you draw on some of the social issues, it's not lived throughout to the implementation. And I think what are some of the elements that we need to remind ourselves, you know, that CSW always emphasize. One, I think there's great emphasis on the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Two, there's also great emphasis on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And also, most importantly, the Convention on the Rights of Child and of optional protocols thereof. And these are some of the global treaties, of course, that we always reflect on as convention and treaties that helps us to center the agenda that we raise in this case. But also part of it is, what are some of these intersectional treaties that we often have to think about, whether you're talking about the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, but as well as looking at the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. And this also does not let go of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, the International Convention on how we eliminate elimination of all forms of racial discrimination and related tolerance as well. So there are quite a number of conventions, and maybe something that I mustn't forget as a reflection, which is also the Convention on the Protection of Rights of all migrant workers and members of their families, where this elements of convention and treaties provides us with this legal framework and comprehensive set of measures for realizing gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls, and most importantly, of course, the fulfillment of this equal enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all. And when you then look at this in the context of LGBTI community, one must never shy away that globally we still have, you know, over 70 countries that criminalize homosexual act. I think we've seen pockets of movement, pockets of change, particularly also here in our region, in Africa, where we've seen a movement of decriminalization. We've seen also in the Global South region, which is the Americas region, which is known as, called as Americas for that matter. I think we've seen island by island decriminalizing. And even here in the region, Seychelles, Angola, Mozambique, Gabon, you know, many of the countries that have been criminalizing. And I think also even welcoming what has just recently happened last week at the level of Kenya, where an organization, ILGALC, has not been registered for the last 10 years. And there was a court judgment that actually was in the favor of the Gay and Lesbian Association. of Kenya. And I think it's quite instrumental to recognize this, because when you then look at what does it mean in practical form and how does it move us to really channel the serious energies that advance and reaffirms the equal protection and meaningful participation of citizens, taking into account the diversity of the citizens, their role and the circumstances. And many LGBTI people in countries where they are criminalized, their lives are met with injustices, socially, politically, but also at the level of economic as well. And here, when you then look at some of the pledges that are going to come out at the level of CSW, where you speak about the role of potential of the role and potential of technology and innovation to improve women's life. What does it mean when it comes to LGBTI people? And I'll give you an example. We are dealing with currently many countries, Ghana, you're talking Uganda, which today Parliament was actually reviewing the submission of a private bill on anti-homosexuality, and with an organization, in fact, few organizations that run a risk of being shut down, SMARC and many others who are being shut down because of what we call NGO Bureau, who has been actually monitoring and censorship for many of the organizations. And even beyond our own region, whether you're looking at Sri Lanka, you're looking at Pakistan and others. These, by the way, remain members of the United Nations. And when you look at what language, what instruments, and also what kind of text go into negotiation documents, whether you speak about how the Commission reflects on recognizing those essential elements, the word all, and I always will make reference to it, all women and girls, where not only will the technology and innovation will be used as a censorship towards others, and which thus far will create injustices, but will also be used to target the very same LGBTI people, particularly those in countries where it's criminalized. So I think where we have to then look at what are the pros and cons when we speak about the use and potential elements of technology. We know there is great potential element where the digital economy, the digital capacity, and also the benefits of inclusive and equitable digital skills that can be developed for all women and girls. But whether these opportunities are inclusive, it's another thing. And let alone not only just talking about LGBTI, you also are reflecting on issues of people with disability and so forth. So we have to really think through what language is being used in making sure that we secure what is just approach, but what is also inclusive and diverse in improving the lives of all. But the premise that we always and constantly have to reflect on, is that once we start to center the prioritization of all women and girls, we have to then look at what areas do we need to cover. Is the language, is the declaration of CSW going to be people-centered? Is it going to be inclusive? Is going to look at the developmental approach that is citing the information or the role of information technology and for everybody? Is it going to also benefit everybody? Is it going to create opportunities for everyone? And also one thing, or some of the things we need to also interrogate: access, utilization, affordability, and also efficiency for that matter. I'll give you an example. Here in South Africa, we have I think it was a research that was done that actually demonstrated that over 90% of South Africans use smartphone, or they have smartphone. But now the question of utilization, it's a serious thing, because whether we are maximizing on the usage of smartphone, it's another thing. We've turned some of the classroom just for improving the education life of young girls, adolescent girls, but these smart classrooms and tablets or use of tablets are not accessible to everyone. So how do we then define improving the quality of life for all in that regard? And why I'm also saying this, another additional research here in South Africa, 74% of LGBTI people are discriminated in school. So which then means even if you are actually making intentional effort to reach out, to be inclusive whatsoever, but you are leaving others behind. So we need to think about what kind of safeguard, what kind of oversight that needs to make great emphasis on what needs to be secured, open, accessible, and peaceful information for all, that people can make use of that communication technology for all women and girls. So this then really underpins the conversation of those very same structural barriers, where you have to look at the forms of discrimination, the marginalization, and that continue to become obstacles, to really achieve what we anticipate. I think it's going to be a very difficult CSW, because reality is that even the global north, global south are in different levels, not only just for us from the LGBTI community, but typically for all women and girls across the globe, looking at the inequality that exists. So there are opportunities that comes with how we can broaden up and make sure that we spread, the aspect of or the importance of, economic resources and how that advances for all, and also how we look at structural transformation as well as key contributors in the economic and really also in combating some of those inequalities, structural inequalities. So the difficulty that also comes with this is that we are all in different levels. I think for us here in the region, the idea that we constantly have to be reminded or we have to reflect on, what really is happening in the region in terms of access, effectiveness of usage of the tools or innovation, but also how affordable and accessible is those innovation and technology, and whether our countries are ready to digitalize in a more fast approach. Digitalization has made that easy, but we are not necessarily transforming or moving in the appropriate way that responds to some of the needs, but also that responds to the prioritization of how we integrate social issues. And I think it's quite important that, I was listening to the last two slides, the emphasis on how we need to constantly, in what we do, who really has access to the digital age, who has access to, the innovation, the gap, the gender gap, the age gap, undermines the level of empowerment and realization of human rights. And also it then speaks and reflects on, when you speak about gender and age gap, at the same time, when you actually go beyond the non-binary context, that you have to look at, who else are you leaving behind for that matter. So I think for me, it's quite important that we still move with inclusive language. We still interrogate the context of how we cover communities that are left behind, the global south, or bridging the gap between the global north and global south, how we also look at worsened situation or worsened economic and social and environment crisis that really we are dealing with in our spaces. Here in South Africa, one of the biggest issues as I'm speaking to you now, we may actually lose signal because we lose shedding. So you can actually understand that even the great use of technology that you and I are utilizing now is compromised by the economic worsening situations that we find ourselves in. So we have to constantly think about how all of these issues, crises that we are dealing with, because crises are colliding. But these crises that are colliding, including public health crisis, a social crisis, economic crisis, how are these multiple issues interrelated to other international priorities, such as energy, such as climate change, such as financial crisis, food security, and many others, which is then related to the SDGs that we constantly are talking about. So we have to think these multiple issues, how are they interrelated to some of the competing priorities? And these very same competing priorities, how are we responding to it? Because then there's a role of what government must be doing. There's a role on what civil society must be doing, including private sector and as well as development agencies. But these issues are heightened because lives are at stake. The LGBTI lives that we are talking about, whether in South Africa, in Uganda, whether in Sri Lanka, in Malaysia, whether in the Caribbean, all of these issues that we constantly have to deal with and respond to. It's a true reflection of the poorest and the most vulnerable are the hardest hit by those issues. And we cannot have any declaration that moves to not prioritize the marginalized communities. So when we speak about all inclusive, diverse languages, we constantly have to be intentional to actually name those important elements around prioritization and how we reverse the hard-won, how we actually should prevent reversal of the hard-won development progress that we've had. I think it's quite important that we are not ignorant of work that we're doing as a developmental approach, how we actually look at who is heavily impacted, how we look at the multiple issues that we are faced with, but also the responsibility, accountability, and transparent. And actually the digital age provides us with that opportunity, to participate actively, to actually look at technology as a solution that we can use to strengthen transformation and utilize its own potential as solution-based to community, to society, whether it's around collecting data, whether it's around locating and actually centering information or solution banks. All of these is provided with inclusive and quality access to information and communication technology. So we have to constantly interrogate that. But we are going to CSW with a refreshed energy. All of us coming together because we prioritize women and girls, gender equality, but that should actually have a lens of transformation. And we then have to make sure that we advocate for all people. We don't only leave the responsibility of LGBTI only to LGBTI people. We constantly need allies to speak up in the health sector, in the education sector, and many other sectors that are there. Speak up about the challenges, speak up about solutions, but speak up about opportunities of creating prosperity for all. And here, even with this centered, innovative approach and use of technology, we actually can improve quality of life for all. Healthy economy relies on a healthy population. Healthy society relies on healthy population. Healthy politics relies on healthy population. And once we all understand the fundamental human rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration that says you are entitled to human rights by virtue of being human. And that responsibility sits with you and I. That responsibility speaks to what you and I are doing to change the livelihood of all. And those are the things that in the work we do, we must safeguard language that is inclusive for security for all. So I hope when we go there into CSW, those who will be participating, but also when we engage post CSW, because declaration must come back to be domesticated in our own countries to ensure that we are not just being rhetoric, but we actually offer a potential for essential full enjoyment of human rights for all, full enjoyment of life, full enjoyment of freedoms, because that's what we have been fighting for. Move away from colonization, and we then also observe and not actually forget that it has happened, but actually we must move in the approach that seeks to repair the injustice of the past. And part of repairing the injustice of the past is to make sure that LGBTI people also become free, because without freedom for LGBTI people, you and I still are not free. And I think we need to move in that language when we look at the use of technology, how we make use in a positive manner. How do we build capacity? How do we look at, and address some of the issues of misuse of the very same technology that we're experiencing? So I hope we can actually move with the approach that impacts, the livelihood of everybody, the lives of everybody, but it changes the life of all women and girls, all people that we work with on a daily basis. So I hope, Program Director, I did not steal too much of your time. I thought I should just go straight to the issues that I think are relevant when we speak about the importance of inclusivity, transformation, but also prioritization of all, and how best we can actually tap on the benefits of technology innovation strategies to really change the quality of life for all. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. What an incredible presentation. Thank you for helping us problematize. What do we mean by all? How do we achieve equality and rights for all? What is it to really understand the nuanced and political intersectional lens to this year's priority theme, and to really locate the sources of power, no? And it was really resonating with me, especially a complexity you were raising for this year's CSW is how do we do agenda setting, no? As organizations in the global north and the global south, when we're centering different agendas, and also to continue to call us to center the margins of the margins, no? Within our advocacy and mobilization at CSW. Thank you so much. Such a rich presentation. Really appreciate you joining us today. And thank you. Maybe if you can move to the next slide, Tom, I think it's a good moment just to connect on, we've been hearing from feminists, youth, and LGBTIQ advocacy, organizing, and agendas at CSW this year. We're moving into our next section, now delving into the work to transform patriarchal masculinities for gender justice. Next slide. But to really launch off this final section, it's really important to hone in on accountable advocacy, which is precisely what we're seeking to do, no, as MenEngage Alliance, is to continue to apply our accountability framework to our advocacy and mobilization within these political spaces, no? Which is precisely what you were raising, Steve. It's how do we not contemplate our engagement within CSW as a means to advance the agenda of engaging men and boys solely. It's that we are participating in cross-movement building with marginalized movements, centering the agendas, as standing in solidarity, no, amplifying those demands and calls, and especially, no, the most challenging and political asks and demands of feminists, SRHR, LGBTIQ, and other justice movements. We learned yesterday, for those of you who joined, and of course all of you today joining here, perhaps already are aware, but these issues of SOGI, LGBTIQ rights are some of the most contentious points in the negotiation. So when we talk about accountable advocacy as MenEngage, it's that we are operating as one stakeholder, standing in solidarity and working alongside and behind the leadership of these movements, and seeking to add value when it is relevant, through a masculinities lens, but participating within the broader ecosystem, understanding the backlash, understanding the various factors taking root within that space, as well as standing in solidarity with other movements, amplifying their demands and working in tandem, for the achievement of women's rights and gender justice for all, and to really refrain from or challenge discourses that overtly center a masculinities agenda. We witnessed this at CSW and other political spaces as well. Even the agenda itself is prioritized. Not only to say that we also need to share our seats at the table. So in some ways, when we engage in a policy space, it's like with the thought, and the deeper consideration of how do we act accountably in our engagement within a policy space centered on women's rights and gender justice, as those working in organizations that engage men and boys. It's a broad consideration from participation and taking step back so others' voices can be heard. We heard from Steve, centering the margins of the margins, allowing those voices to share or mobilize, even in spaces that we organize as MenEngage Alliance, all the way through accountability in our engagement within the advocacy for the agreed conclusions, where we're not just providing recommendations on language related to engaging men and boys, but we're centering these really complex and difficult political asks of feminist and LGBTIQ agendas, So just a brief introduction here as we launch off into this final section. We are running a bit late, so just to note, we might go a bit over, but that this concept of accountable advocacy in theory and practice is so key for us to really contemplate as we're heading into CSW and continue to strategize on what that means for us as an alliance working to transform patriarchal masculinities. Having said that, we'll go on to our next presenter, and Martela Hernandez Europa, a MenEngage member from Latin America, working with an initiative, Leo Limpia. And it's an exciting presentation where we begin to explore what exactly our MenEngage members doing related to this year's priority theme. So I'll leave it at that, and over to you, Martela. Thanks so much for joining, and looking forward to learning from you.
Hola, no estoy como en las... Ok, decía que si se puede pasar a la siguiente y volver conmigo en 5 minutos para arreglar el tema del audio y así, estaría genial.
A lot of text here, but I'll summarize it quickly. Just in terms of the language advocacy, we were speaking about accountable advocacy, And some of what we witness oftentimes within the negotiations themselves is really diluted references to work with men and boys, often calling for men and boys as beneficiaries of change, and just really including a highly depoliticized agenda, Just wanted to share in part of our accountable advocacy strategy, often on the negotiations, in addition to centering, as we were saying, some of the most difficult asks, including SRHR, LGBTIQ rights, and comprehensive sexuality education, is really opting to go from 10, 15 diluted references of men and boys as beneficiaries of change to one consolidated, nuanced, and political paragraph. Very often, we've seen too, which we always include, as you can see here, gender nonconforming people, the rights of gender nonconforming people. And we've seen that the inclusion of that language within paragraphs on engaging men and boys has often gotten that language approved rather than in other locations, because of the prioritization of this agenda. So it's a really interesting point to consider when we're thinking about accountable advocacy in our strategy on how to engage in the negotiations. So just to highlight, this was our recommendation for this year, and one of the things that was added, that has been moving through the negotiation rounds is also this need for accountability, for men and boys to be held accountable for their behavior, and also for all initiatives aimed at ending violence against all women and girls to be centered, to promote accountability and to be designed with the ultimate aim of ensuring that the concerns of all women and girls, their rights, their empowerment, their safety are centered. So this was just an exciting little snippet, of language that we're seeking to advance in this negotiation, where accountability is front and center. The rights of gender nonconforming people are centered. There's one other paragraph, where SRHR and the roles and responsibilities of men and boys and sexual and reproductive health and rights is included. So just a bit of a snippet, in terms of accountable advocacy in the negotiations. Yeah, in our collective political agenda this year, just very quickly, it's really in line with feminist, LGBTIQ, and youth demands this year. But honing in on that unique analysis, of transforming patriarchal masculinities to contribute to unpacking some of those themes, like addressing the proliferation of misogynistic online groups, spaces, and narratives, the manosphere, as we've been hearing today, and preventing, eliminating, responding to online sexual and gender-based violence, including naming male perpetration of digital harassment and sexual abuse. And also, on the other end, promoting nonviolent actions, attitudes, and values by men and boys, and broadening access to digital tools. And then also contribution to the analysis, at a feminist systems change level, where accountability for digital platforms and governance continue to play under the patriarchal logic of domination, exclusion, control, lack of accountability, impunity. So just a quick recap, of some of the main themes for our political agenda. And next slide. Yeah, in a invitation, we're launching a sign-on based upon this political agenda, and we would like to just share it with all of you. If you would like to join, really calling, wonderful. Linez, you're available now. Over to you, just 1 minute. Maybe my colleagues can share this in the chat. So this is an open invitation for all members and partners, to sign on to the statement centering our collective politics for this year's session, and directed to the UN Secretary General, UN Women ED, and the CSW Bureau, calling on urgent action for bold and progressive commitments to advance women's rights and gender justice at CSW. And to also do so by dismantling patriarchal masculinities online and offline. Thanks so much. If you can share that in the chat. And then over to you, Linez. Thanks so much. I think Linez has dropped off, actually. Martela, are you ready to jump in?
Can you hear me? Hola.
Hola. Bienvenida. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Sí.
And we'll share screen for you. Thank you.
Gracias. Igual también no terminé de poner todas las diapositivas en el Drive. Entonces, si es posible, a ver si ahorita en un momentito me podrían apoyar haciendo mi confitriona también, pero voy a entrar, estoy en el celular y voy a entrar desde la computadora en cuanto se conecte. Bueno, ya les decía Jenny que voy a platicar un poco como miembro de MenEngage de algunas otras formas de incidencia que hacemos a nivel local y regional, desde los movimientos feministas y desde las juventudes feministas en América Latina. Bueno, esto que llamamos Ley Olimpia y la lucha por espacios libres de violencia para las mujeres y las niñas en Internet también. Si me ayudan con la siguiente diapositiva. Un poco sobre quiénes somos y cómo, o sea, nuestros orígenes. ¿Me ayudan con la siguiente?
Next slide, please.
Ok. Nos llamamos a nosotras mismas Frente Nacional para la Sororidad y también y Defensoras Digitales. Y voy a explicar un poco qué es cada uno. El Frente Nacional para la Sororidad es una organización feminista especializada en violencia digital a través de a través de las telecomunicaciones, de los espacios virtuales. Estamos presentes al menos en 26 de los 32 estados de nuestro país y también ahora en algunas provincias de Argentina y también de Ecuador. Tiene aproximadamente 10 años que comenzamos un movimiento político feminista para defender los derechos digitales de las mujeres y las niñas en México y ahora pues también en otros países de Latinoamérica. Básicamente lo que hemos hecho ha sido, bueno, como digamos lo más relevante para, digo, a nivel mediático quizás y de incidencia política es que logramos reformas legales en México que ayudan a visibilizar, a definir, a prevenir y a castigar también la violencia, así como también atender la violencia digital en contra de las mujeres y niñas, haciendo que el Estado reconozca que es una violencia basada en género. Y pues actualmente ya fue aprobado en todo el territorio nacional. Fuimos estado por estado haciéndolo. Y estamos también legislando, como decía, en Argentina y en Ecuador. ¿Me ayudan con la siguiente, por fin? La siguiente diapositiva. Bueno, defensoras digitales, por su parte, son como pequeñas células, pequeños grupos que hacen parte del Frente Nacional para la Sororidad y consisten en que son grupos de activistas que principalmente se conformaron de mujeres y niñas que en algún momento de sus vidas sufrieron algún incidente de violencia digital y se unieron para impulsar la Ley Olimpia, este conjunto de reformas que visibilizan, previenen, atienden y sancionan la violencia digital, particularmente la difusión y producción de contenido íntimo sin consentimiento. Se llamó en México Ley Olimpia. Bueno, una vez que Ley Olimpia era aprobada en cada uno de los estados, se conservaban estas células de activistas y se configuraron como grupos justamente de defensoras, defensoras que apoyaban a otras mujeres y a otras niñas que tenían incidentes de violencia digital en sus vidas y orientándolas en diferentes niveles de atención. Actualmente tenemos una metodología de atención a víctimas que consiste en 4 ejes: el psicoemocional, lo legal, la ciberseguridad y la contención comunitaria. Bueno, si me apoyan con la siguiente. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. Ahora sobre un poco cómo comenzó todo. Next slide, please. Contarles la historia de la fundadora de este pues gran movimiento que ahora podemos nombrar un movimiento político feminista regional. Es Olimpia Corelmelo y ella no es que haya salido con la idea de reformar leyes en el país y así volverse una líder, sino que fue a partir de que ella, cuando tenía 18 años, fue difundida, grabó un video sexual con quien entonces era su pareja, y ese video sexual al tiempo fue difundido, lo cual la orilló por el juicio social, la estigmatización, a dejar su trabajo, a dejar la escuela, a dejar incluso el lugar donde vivía, porque el acoso era demasiado fuerte. Incluso llegó a aparecer su imagen íntima en periódicos locales. Y bueno, fue insoportable, ¿no? Mucho de lo que vivió, incluso llegó a pensar en el suicidio muchas veces. Y finalmente, con el apoyo de su mamá y de otras mujeres, fue que decidió denunciar, y fue ahí que se dio cuenta que en el marco legal mexicano no existía o sea, eso no era una conducta reprobable según el marco legal mexicano en aquel tiempo. Entonces incluso recibió más revictimización por parte de las autoridades que en lugar de defenderla, la culpabilizaron y bueno, fue una cuestión bastante revictimizante. Entonces, bueno, gracias. Next slide, please. Bueno, entonces de ahí fue que Olimpia investigó, decidió juntarse con otras mujeres que habían vivido cosas similares y fue que se emprendió así un movimiento, ¿no? Así es como les contaba yo, que se funda, ella es fundadora del Frente Nacional para la Sororidad. Las células de defensoras digitales se fueron conformando de forma muy orgánica en cada una de las entidades donde íbamos promoviendo estas reformas legales para que estas conductas sí fueran sancionadas, sí fueran reconocidas como una forma de violencia, sobre todo como una forma de violencia basada en género. Y bueno, como algunos ahora después de toda esta larga lucha que ha significado alrededor de 10 años para nosotras, en todo el territorio de México está aprobada esta legislación que consiste en 2 reformas, una a la Ley General de Acceso de las Mujeres a una Vida Libre de Violencia y otra al Código Penal, en donde en una lo que se pretende es describir, definir la violencia digital como una forma de violencia basada en género a partir del uso de tecnologías y con eso traer responsabilidades para el Estado de capacitar, de invertir recursos, de medir la problemática, de buscar la prevención y por otro lado el Código Penal busca sancionarlo. Igual no había terminado. En cuanto a los ejes que nos articulan en nuestras líneas de acción es justamente atención a víctimas, pero también desarrollo de conocimiento e investigación en el tema y por último también y muy importante sí, la incidencia pública al respecto, no solamente reformando las legislaciones, sino también apoyando en la generación de políticas públicas, dando capacitaciones, diseñando programas educativos para que toda esta experiencia y todo lo que hemos acumulado a lo largo de este tiempo, tanto en nuestra propia experiencia como en nuestra investigación al respecto, pues pueda ser conocido, ¿no? Y además que las autoridades lo puedan aplicar correctamente. Ahora sí, perdón, la siguiente. Un poco este tema que está en grande, que dice hashtag ni porno ni venganza, en inglés it's like and it's not porn and it's not revenge, porque resulta que cuando empezamos esta lucha, la única referencia bibliográfica que encontramos era con el base en el término revenge porn, un término acuñado en Estados Unidos para nombrar esta forma de violencia de divulgar contenido íntimo sexual de mujeres principalmente en línea sin su consentimiento. Bueno, nosotras partimos del hecho de que no es pornografía, pero tampoco es venganza, no es pornografía porque además de que tenemos una posición muy crítica a la industria de la pornografía, pero tampoco es no es un tema en el que las personas que están ahí exhibidas hayan decidido, hayan aceptado que su imagen sexual sea explotada para consumo de otras personas. No son actrices, no están actuando, no hay un contrato, no están obteniendo ninguna ganancia. Entonces, no puede llamarse pornografía, no tiene nada que ver con eso. Y no es venganza porque eso presupone que nosotras hicimos algo primero para que se vengaran de nosotras y tampoco es así, ¿no? Consideramos que el término porno venganza es bastante revictimizante, además de como lo que decía, ¿no? Nuestra visión crítica sobre la industria de la pornografía es entre muchas otras cosas, porque consideramos que tiene un impacto muy nocivo en la formación de masculinidades e identidades sexuales de los hombres, porque contribuye a la hipersexualización, a la cosificación, a la mercantilización del cuerpo femenino, además de que causa distorsiones que resultan en violencia sexual contra las mujeres. Y bueno, sí se construyen imaginarios sexuales, sobre todo por parte de los hombres, y ahorita voy a explicar un poco por qué, principalmente por parte de los hombres, aunque creo que para la mayoría de ustedes es bastante claro, pero igual no está de más. Pasa que se erotiza la situación de violentar a las mujeres, se considera, bueno, a través de las ideas que construye la pornografía, se van construyendo subjetividades, es decir, el deseo de los hombres se va construyendo sobre premisas de subordinar a las mujeres y de inferiorizarlas y someterlas. Se va erotizando la humillación, la subordinación, la violencia contra ellas. Es decir, van encontrando placer en eso. ¿Y por qué me refiero particularmente a los hombres? Porque acá cito un informe de Save the Children en el que se da cuenta de cómo llegados los 12 años, más del 87% de los hombres ya ha consumido alguna vez pornografía, siendo su primer encuentro con ella entre los 6 y 7 años. Bueno, si comparamos estas cifras, es una población representativa de la población mundial, según lo que recuerdo en este informe. Bueno, comparado con el porcentaje de la población que tiene acceso a educación sexual integral, por ejemplo, como forma de contrarrestar las narrativas o las formas de aprender sobre la sexualidad que encontramos en la pornografía, que está disponible para todo el mundo de forma amplia, a la altura de un clic, en Internet, bueno, pues es bastante alarmante, ¿no? Encontramos que no hay forma realmente de contrarrestar el impacto. Bueno, sí, siguiente, porfa, diapositiva. Y bueno, ya creo que expliqué ya que lo que es Ley Olimpia en realidad, como primer conjunto de reformas que vienen de parte de la sociedad civil, que a pesar de que fueron subidas a todos los congresos locales, tienen un origen en un movimiento social de mujeres jóvenes, y bueno, que no tiene tintes partidistas, no busca ningún acceso al poder, simplemente promueve la visibilización de la violencia digital desde una perspectiva feminista, ¿no? Y con un enfoque en las víctimas. Y bueno, ya conté un poco sobre qué modificaciones legales implica, así que si podemos seguir a la siguiente diapositiva. Entonces, ahí acabé, pero sí quiero contarles un poco sobre el informe de violencia digital que generamos, si aún tengo un poquito de tiempo, si no, también avísenme por favor para parar, pero si puedo contar un poco sobre el informe de violencia digital y algunos de los hallazgos y quizás presentar desde mi dispositivo, porque eso no lo terminé de agregar. Bueno, estoy atenta para que me indiquen si se puede.
Gracias. 5 minutos, Marcela.
Ok, de acuerdo. Entonces, como decía, una de nuestras líneas de acción es la de generar información, la de hacer investigación al respecto, y recientemente en diciembre presentamos nuestro primer informe de violencia digital en el cual congregamos más de 1,700 casos que nosotras hemos acompañado y atendido a lo largo de los años 2019, 2020 y 2021. Como decía, una de nuestras líneas es atención a víctimas, entonces esto no fue porque nosotras dijéramos, hey, nosotras atendemos víctimas, sino porque al tomar visibilidad mediática esta lucha, todas las personas que se sienten en vulnerabilidad ante sus casos de violencia digital, recurrían a nosotras. Entonces fuimos de inicio atendiendo como desde simplemente la empatía, desde solamente la contención, de una forma muy como sorora nada más, pero después sí que empezamos a profesionalizarnos en las formas de atender, creando esta metodología de la que les hablaba. ¿Me pueden permitir compartir, por favor, rápidamente? Entonces, hicimos una sistematización de todos esos casos recibidos a lo largo de estos 3 años y encontramos un perfil de las personas que típicamente son víctimas de estas formas de violencia, pero también un perfil de quienes típicamente son agresores. Para esto usamos no solamente los testimonios y narraciones de las personas que se acercan a nosotras para sus casos, para información sobre sus casos, sino también hicimos un análisis de Big Data ahorita les voy a contar con qué metodología. Entonces, bueno, este es un poco del informe. Esta es la portada, que por cierto MenEngage acaba de ayudarnos a traducir al inglés y al francés. Bueno, en el informe presentamos esta herramienta, Violentómetro Virtual, que en realidad fue creada en 2016 por Olimpia. Es un esfuerzo para visibilizar de forma gráfica diferentes tipologías de violencia digital que podemos encontrar en línea, que tienen por lo general, sí, como un enfoque, y tienden a victimizar más a las mujeres. Pero un poco más sobre los hallazgos es esto, ¿no? Hacemos una sistematización, una contabilización de en qué meses, en qué años hemos recibido más casos. Es notorio que a partir de la aprobación de Ley Olimpia a nivel nacional redujeron drásticamente los casos, por ejemplo, y como subieron de manera muy, muy, muy importante, también drástica, a lo largo de la pandemia. Las entidades también que tienen más casos son en las grandes ciudades, que el Estado de México y la Ciudad de México particularmente, y es evidente que es un problema de género porque 95% de las personas que acudieron a nosotras para ver estas situaciones eran mujeres, en tanto que el 80% de las personas agresoras eran hombres. Acá procuramos hacer como una contextualización histórica de lo que ha significado la sexualidad femenina en el patriarcado, y vemos como en todas las épocas históricas se ha sometido a las mujeres, no solamente como trabajadoras, como mano de obra, sino también como reproductoras y como para ofrecer servicios sexuales. Pero esto se masifica de forma considerable con la llegada del capitalismo, en particular del capitalismo neoliberal, y toma formas muy particulares con la llegada de la digitalidad a través de plataformas pues justamente pornográficas, las llamadas de pornografía casera, y también plataformas en formato de redes sociales de micromercenazgo como OnlyFans, ¿no? Y bueno, hacemos también una vinculación de cómo dependiendo de qué tan integrados tengan los mandatos de género sobre la feminidad, las personas víctimas pueden enfrentar de mejor o de peor manera una situación de violencia digital, tanto al momento de enfrentarse a los focos rojos de que a lo mejor alguien está queriendo abusar de ellos en espacios digitales, como cuando ya ha sucedido. Y bueno, finalmente respecto a las víctimas, son principalmente estudiantes entre 18 y 30 años en el nivel universitario, y las principales violencias son la difusión de contenido íntimo sin consentimiento. Y creo que esta sección es sumamente importante para acá, para nuestro contexto de MenEngage, porque es importante hablar de quiénes son los agresores, y este perfilamiento de quiénes son ellos nos ayuda mucho, ¿no? A identificarlo. Principalmente suelen ser exparejas de sus víctimas, son hombres entre 18 y 30 años también, y que su propósito, su motivación principal es causar una afectación pública a la imagen de su víctima. Ocupan diferentes plataformas, pero entre Facebook fue una de las más mencionadas por las personas que denunciaron, pero por acá en el análisis de antropología social digital, que es haciendo uso de las herramientas de Big Data, nos podemos dar cuenta, y ahorita les voy a contar un poco de la metodología, bueno, que Twitter es también una de las redes más importantes para la realización de estas formas de violencia. La metodología que se siguió para este análisis de antropología social digital es que... Ok, hicimos un barrido, digamos, del discurso que normalmente nosotras conocemos, que se usa para solicitar contenido íntimo no consensuado, y a través de eso identificamos perfiles de redes sociales, particularmente, como decía, en Twitter, por la publicidad que tiene Twitter, y logramos encontrar que, bueno, un conglomerado de personas que usan eso, y dentro de ese conglomerado diferentes características. En general, el perfil de las personas agresoras son
Personas reservadas, distantes, que no cultivan su inteligencia emocional, se enfocan en las cuestiones rutinarias, tangibles, les importa mucho lo que piensen los demás de ellos y reprimen sus sentimientos, ¿no? Su emocionalidad. Son hombres, mayoritariamente más de un 80%, concentrados en las grandes ciudades, lo cual confirma los testimonios de las víctimas. Tienen una escolaridad alta en la universidad, se dedican principalmente a ventas y servicios administrativos y no tienen hijos y son solteros. También quiero enfatizar en esta parte que consumen mucho, bueno, esto en este análisis de antropología social nos indica qué medios consumen, qué sitios siguen, cuáles son sus influencias principales, sus marcas preferidas, los eventos a los que asisten. Y es muy importante resaltar que consumen mucho pornografía y que también tienen como fuente de información medios de ultraderecha. Acá, bueno, se visibiliza por conglomerado y esto seguramente no les hace sentido porque este es un contexto mexicano, pero es importante justamente dar cuenta de que los medios de comunicación informativos que se están consumiendo son tintes de antiderechos, aunque y la afinidad con personajes de la vida pública, política, también son personas, pues sí, de tendencias políticas de derecha, aunque también hay algunos conglomerados que tienen afinidad con posturas progresistas, ¿no? Son los menos, pero también pasa. Y bueno, un poco sobre los hallazgos y algunas recomendaciones para transformar de las prácticas de los hombres y sus masculinidades de potenciales agresores a potenciales agentes de transformación social. Justamente posicionábamos la educación sexual integral acompañada de educación digital, sobre la interpelación necesaria en los grupos de pares, es decir, que si te mandan estas imágenes, interpeles a las personas que te las están enviando, mucho sobre la sexualidad masculina, sobre el hecho de que las decisiones que toman los hombres en la intimidad, ahí donde nadie los ve, ahí donde se sienten que nadie los va a juzgar, son también políticas porque contribuyen a continuar el sistema patriarcal o irlo deconstruyendo, sobre la articulación política de los hombres contra la violencia y la participación de las mujeres feministas en las redes de masculinidades. Obviamente no puedo ahondar en cada uno ahorita por el tiempo, pero básicamente es la idea general de este informe. Y muchísimas gracias, me ha encantado la sesión, me ha nutrido muchísimo los ponentes anteriores y pues agradezco mucho este espacio. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Marcela. Thank you so much for that presentation. Incredible insights from the report, Defensoras Digitales. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for staying. We've gone way over time. Appreciate you staying in till the end. Such incredible presentations, learning so much today. And Liness is back with us. So Liness, over to you as our final speaker. Thank you so much.
I'll just present from another gadget. Mine is giving me problems.
Sounds good. Go ahead, please.
So I will present on disability rights and demands from Polygam. I'm Linus Bandua from Parents of Disabled Children Association of Malawi. When you think about disability, those are people who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with barriers in society may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. Disability status. Malawi has a population of 18 million people, where 10% of the persons with disability are persons with disabilities, and about 5.1% are women and girls with disabilities. Women and girls with disabilities are multiple disadvantaged. Negative attitudes start right away when a girl child with a disability is born in a family. This is where the hassle starts. The mother faces discrimination and mockery from neighbors and relatives. This makes the mother to become bitter to the child and with disability and other people surrounding her, since she's double discriminated as a parent of a child with a disability and as well as an abandoned mother. Because most of the times whenever there's a child with a disability in a family, men run away. They don't want to take the responsibility. So the responsibility remains to the mother, which is really hectic. Disability status. This makes her not to accept the child with disability, whereby she chooses to lock the child indoors, where she has no chance to play with fellow children, as well as going to school, to avoid shame and embarrassment. Again, women and girls are multiple disadvantaged as a person with a disability, as a woman, and finally, as a woman with a disability. Barriers and demands. Negative attitude starts right away from the families where they are born. Fathers run away from their responsibility by saying that they are not part and parcel of the child with a disability. The mothers are left with bitterness because they are embarrassed by family members and the entire community. As a result, they choose to lock the child with disability indoor. They are taken as second citizens and useless. This makes them not to go to school and lack of exposure. We demand the government, through the Ministry of Gender, to do a lot of disability awareness for parents to accept their children with disabilities, to come up with a law that a father or mother who ran away from his or her child should be punished by the law. The next barrier is environment. This makes persons with disabilities to become more disabled, e.g. the terrain of the roads, inaccessible infrastructure, schools, hospitals, information not in accessible formats, and water and sanitation places. We demand the government to punish people and institutions who do not comply to disability-friendly structures. Government to ensure that roads are maintained frequently using the government constituency development funds, and those who do not comply should be brought to book. Belief and culture. This is another barrier to women and girls with disabilities. There are a lot of myths and misconceptions which put women and girls with disabilities at risk, e.g. the belief that if you have HIV and AIDS, if you are positive and you have sex with a woman with a disability, you will be cleansed. Persons with disabilities do not have feelings and they do not need intimate relationships. This promotes gender-based violence to women and girls with disabilities. We demand the government to come up with a lot of sensitization messages and stiff punishment to the culprits to stop the tendency. Lack of political will. We have good and inclusive policies, but they are not being implemented. There are international and local tools which have not been signed and ratified, and vice versa. E.g., the African Disability Protocol, the Disability Act, which passed in Parliament in 2012 but has not been enacted. We demand the government to sign and ratify the tools and enact the Disability Act to ensure that rights of women and girls with disabilities are not violated, to create a constituency of persons with disabilities in the parliament, and it should have a deliberate action to have more women with disabilities, to remind the government on issues of women and girls with disabilities. Another barrier is education. Most women with disabilities are not educated because of the background mentioned above. Schools are not accessible, lack of learning and teaching materials, especially to the deaf and deaf-blind and the blind. The assistive devices are expensive and they attract duty. And this makes most children with disabilities not to go to school. Inadequate special needs teachers. Negative attitude from teachers and fellow students. Inaccessible wash at schools and change rooms for girls at schools with disabilities. The so-called inclusive education do not have a holistic approach in its operation. We demand government to revisit the education policy and make it inclusive. The so-called inclusive education policy to be inclusive and holistic. All teachers to be trained in special needs at the colleges, and those out of colleges to go for refresher course. Government to ensure that private schools are inclusive as government schools. Government to fund Malawi against physical disabilities on operations and outreach programs to resume catering for free and locally made assistive devices, maintenance and physiotherapy. Another barrier is health. This is an area where women and girls face discrimination. Health messages are not in accessible formats. There is communication barrier between the hospital personnel and deaf-blind patients, which end up in assumptions, and it has big effect on women and girls with disabilities. These people miss out on safe motherhood and HIV and AIDS. Negative attitude from hospital personnel to women and girls with disabilities. Lack of assistive devices and messages on SHRR among women and girls with disabilities. We demand the government through Ministry of Health to introduce understanding disability and sign language in the curriculum of hospital personnel training for them to be inclusive. To fund MAP, to restart outreach clinics and operations to produce and distribute more locally made assistive devices and physiotherapy for better mobility. And the last one is access to justice. And this is another serious area. Most women and girls with disability are denied justice. Most cases of women and girls with disabilities are not concluded or are acquitted. The problem is that our judicial personnel were not trained in understanding disability, sign language, and they are not specialists in some other severe and multiple disabilities communication. They also have negative attitude towards their clients because of the terminology used in the penal code. Courts and police stations are not accessible. We demand the government, through Ministry of Justice, to come up with a deliberate inclusive policy on cases of women and girls with disabilities, to be trained on understanding disability and be able to communicate with the victim with no doubts, if not use reasonable accommodation by allowing a person who communicates better with the victim to accompany or speak on her behalf. They should also be as specialists on severe disability to reduce the cost of hiring from other countries. Thank you very much. This is the end of my presentation.
Ganesh, thank you so much. That was incredibly informative, sharing on some of the barriers experienced from women and girls with disabilities, from infrastructure challenges to social norms, and then your recommendations on how we can move towards ensuring the achievement of rights of those with varying levels of ability, from legislative recommendations and as well institutional awareness raising, and the judicial system as well. It was really incredible to learn from you. Thank you so much. And I want to guide participants too to the presentation that you shared. Thank you for sharing that additional knowledge with all of us. So please feel free to download that, and then we'll also include it in our resource bank. So thank you very much. Again, a big thank you to everyone for staying on as we've moved way past the hour. It was such a rich session, learned so much from all the speakers. I'm just wondering if anybody wants to jump in with reflection or any final thoughts, since all of you have been so dedicated to staying online for this long. Just opening it up to one or two comments for anyone that may wish to jump in. And then we'll wrap up for today. No, looking forward to seeing all of you at CSW and also follow our mobilization for virtual participation as well, which we've shared some information. Maybe a colleague of mine can share in the chat box the mail out that has key information for how you can participate digitally, if not in person. Any final thoughts? I'm seeing some appreciation in the chat box for the session. Thank you very much. And yes, we will be engaging. Sorry, is someone unmuting?
Bueno, yo no sé si me escuchan bien. Pues primero que nada, pues agradecer, en verdad que estuve escuchando las participaciones anteriores y la que pasó después de mí, y de verdad es increíble información. Creo que de forma conjunta con todo esto podemos construir mucho, porque se ha enriquecido mucho el debate. Los elementos informativos han sido súper valiosos. El análisis sobre el backlash o la ultraderecha, sus vínculos con los movimientos de hombres machistas, con los agresores sexuales en línea, por ejemplo, pero también con todos los movimientos geopolíticos en la actualidad, ¿no? Lo que estamos encontrando en la realidad mundial, o sea, contemporánea, y que creo que se va a reflejar mucho en el CSW, pues da para mucho análisis. Y bueno, los vínculos me parecen súper relevantes, súper importantes. Las reflexiones también de cómo no es tan claro a veces la línea, ¿no? De dónde están los movimientos antiderechos y dónde están los movimientos progresistas, porque como que de pronto parecen haberse infiltrado, o como decía por ahí en la presentación del Backlash, que me pareció súper importante, de cómo para algunos problemáticas en específico hacen alianzas con, pues sí, como estratégicas que no permiten visibilizar bien en qué lado están, ¿no? Y bueno, creo que igual ya cierro, pero eso, creo que eso es de lo que ha nutrido mucho esta sesión, y lo agradezco mucho.
Gracias, Marcela. Completely agreed. It's alarming, the sophistication of anti-rights actors, and all of their strategies for infiltrating these spaces. And I was reflecting on Alexis's presentation about its coordination now from UN to also the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, and also UN in New York, and these groups expanding to Geneva, and all of their tactics for sounding like secular missions. And there's so much to unpack. And as we mentioned, this is just a starting point of a much deeper discussion we're hoping to have as MenEngage Alliance moving forward on Backlash, and the role of our work in transforming patriarchal masculinities. And this session, as we've heard today, is really an opportunity, to begin centering our political agenda on these topics, especially with the manosphere being such an incredible element for the coordination of Backlash online, as well as we've heard today, such an incredible breadth of critical topics that we need to center in solidarity with other justice movements at this year's session to advance women's rights and hopefully achieve a progressive outcome. Anyone else? One more contribution and then we'll wrap up. I don't know if my co-organizing colleagues wanted to share anything, but please jump in if you have any thoughts. Rumbi, I saw you were quite active on the chat. If you wanted to share anything.
No, thanks, Jenny. Just to say that this was really quite a very great session, quite engaging, very insightful presentations from the speakers. And just to say thank you for really moderating it so well. And thank you to everyone who stayed on until the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Rumbi. Agreed. Thank you for your commitment to collectively learning so that we can engage in an accountable way as MenEngage Alliance in this year's session. Tom has shared the link to the various elements of our mobilization this year, including some caucus meetings. No, we're going to continue to politically strategize as the session begins, and then at the midpoint. So we invite you to that. And then just another invitation, to join this sign-on statement, which we will be sharing with key policymakers, halfway through CSW, to really try to propel progressive and political outcome for this year's session. Thank you very much to all speakers. Super appreciative to all participants as well. Thank you to the translators for helping us move through the session in various languages. And I think that brings us to a close. Appreciate all of you. Thank you.